was on fire when I went through my backyard. I am excited to be here today to introduce Sil. Sil is a retired battalion chief from Youngstown Fire Department, having served for 39 years. He is a hazardous materials specialist, paramedic, and HAZMAT and fire instructor. Sil sat on the state of Ohio's HAZMAT Weapons of Mass Destruction Technical Advisory Committee and was a regional coordinator for 18 years, helping build and or bolster the HAZMAT WMD teams, develop rules and regulations, quantify and qualify equipment, and training and coordination response with local, state, federal, and military agencies. Sil now works as a consultant, advisor, and is absolutely a subject matter expert for other organizations and recently advised the law firms that sued Norfolk Southern for the East Palestine derailment. Sil testified to the Pennsylvania 43rd Grand Jury on oil and gas drilling concerns. His expert opinions can be found in multiple oil and gas related reports, documentaries, and in publications like Rolling Stone, and most recently in Justin Noble's book, Petroleum 238. I personally met Sil after the train derailment and chemical disaster in my community of East Palestine, Ohio. And while East Palestine is not the first chemical disaster, Sil does share my belief that East Palestine has the potential to be a catalyst for systemic change on multiple levels, from emergency response improvements, rail safety, healthcare opportunities, chemical handling, plastics, the list goes on. I have also had the pleasure of working with Chief as a member of Buckeye Environmental Network to prevent ongoing and unnecessary industrial pollution in Youngstown, Ohio. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce you today to Chief Sil.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Anton. Thank you, Buckeye Environmental, for sponsoring and doing this. Thank you all for coming and listening to me. Um, I hope you all get something out of this. We're going to do some comparisons and analysis on, good, bad examples and what happens when it's supposed to go down right. Reason why I decided to do this, and I talked with Anton about it, is because in my work, working with other grassroots organizations that are starting to pop up, I noticed that there is a large vacuum as to people's knowledge about EPCRA, SARA Title III, the RCRA laws, and all that other chemical right to know stuff. And even in Norfolk Southern incident in East Palestine, there was large gaps in communications that should be there, large gaps in performance. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover some of the EPCRA laws, and start off with good, bad examples. I have been able to actually be in the fire service pre-EPCRA and post-EPCRA. Pre-EPCRA, I ended up going to a wastewater treatment plant chlorine leak that ended up with 3 people in the hospital, one of which being my partner on the ambulance, and 3 workers. There was no material safety data sheet information. There was no pre-planning. In fact, we were there on the ambulance and we seen the green and orange clouds. And there's, oh yeah, that's just chlorine, no big deal. It ended up with 4 people in the hospital and I had a sore throat. So that was pre-EPCRA. So moving on, we're going to go to the next right to know laws. The right to know laws in the United States include the Hazardous Communication Standards, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. These laws require that the public be informed about hazardous chemicals, their uses, and releases into the environment. These laws, are kind of written in stone for now and pretty much dictate what goes on in the world. EPCRA, the most important federal right to know law, is nestled in the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, or more commonly known as SARA, and is known as the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. This was adopted by Congress in 1986 in response to the deadly accident Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India in 1984. It killed about 3,000 people, probably harmed about another 15,000 people. It was one of the biggest, it was a call to action, and the government said, well, that can't happen here, but Institute, West Virginia, it happened again. So they acted quickly and they enacted the EPCRA laws. EPCRA itself protects public health, safety, and environmental uh, things from chemical hazards. We're protecting the environment, we're protecting the public, we're protecting first responders, we're protecting everybody. It requires federal and state government, local agencies, tribal nations, and industry to partner in implementing emergency planning and preparedness. As you can see in the picture, I was uh, talking with a member of the 52nd Weapons of Mass Destruction. So it started pairing even the military in their response, into the whole thing. EPCRA itself has four major provisions: the emergency planning section, which is 301 through 303, the emergency release notification, section 304, the hazardous chemical storage reporting requirements, sections 311 through 312, the toxic chemical release inventory, section 313, and the emergency planning. It establishes the requirements for emergency planning at the local level, including the creation of local emergency planning committees, or LEPCs. Now, these are kind of important because um, they're your gateway to getting information. It also develops community emergency response plans, and that comes right out of the Tier 2 reporting through the LAPCs. Here in Ohio, they're required to do tabletop exercise. In a 3-year period, they're required to do a tabletop, a on paper, and an actual physical exercise. We're also required to periodically do what's called uh, screenings and scenarios for any facility that carries um, you know, bad chemicals. We call them LDH chemicals, IDLH chemicals, immediately dangerous to life and health. That also includes uh, chemicals in transit, like if you have rail lines. Like in Youngstown, we would train a lot because we had 3 rail lines that would go through. EPCRA Emergency Planning 301 and 303 refers to sections 301, 302, and 303 of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know. Community emergency response plans address potential hazardous chemical releases in given areas. Essentially, it mandates that the community with facilities and transportation modes handling chemicals must have a plan in place to respond to those emergencies. Like I said, it also mandates training. The local emergency planning committees, or the LEPCs, typically include representatives from the elected officials, be it state, county, or tribal, law enforcement, fire departments, emergency management, public health, environmental agencies, transportation personnel, hospital representatives, community groups, media representatives, and facility owners. Now, it's a very inclusive group, and you see their media representatives, and the reason why they're there is because the media is our access point to what is actually going on. The LAPC meetings are open to the public. Community members, local officials, emergency responders, representatives from the industry handling hazardous materials, and all media can and should attend. Find out, you find out when they are, and then you go and you attend them. You have a voice there. You are able to attend. They are applicable for now to the Sunshine Act. Anyone interested in their community emergency planning can attend this meetings because they, like I said, are considered a public body meeting with notices typically published in advance, or you can call the local EMA as to when they're going to have their meetings. LEPCs discuss and develop emergency response plans related to hazardous materials within a community. Emergency release notifications. EPCRA Section 304 requires the immediate reporting of an accident or an incident or release of an extremely hazardous substance, or an EHS, above its reportable quantities, or the RQs, on the EPA's list of lists. The local emergency planning committee local emergency planning committee notification often begins with the actual 911 call reporting the incident. And the reason why that is because the fire department or whatever responding agency gets there then reports to the HAZMAT if they need a HAZMAT. HAZMAT is usually involved with the EPA So all of that occurs at that time. Hazardous chemical storage reporting. Under the EPCRA section 311 and 312, facilities are required to report two things. One, the presence of hazardous chemicals on site by submitting material safety data sheets, or as we call them now, SDSs. Or two, annual inventory reporting detailing the quantity and location of these chemicals, referred to, as I said before, the Tier 2 reporting report things. There are 4 reports to this. Tier 2 reports essentially provide the community with information about the potential chemicals at a facility to aid in the emergency planning. They're crucial to doing the pre-planning. Remember, I said we do screenings and scenarios, and the Tier 2 is very important to do that. Part 1, what is reported? Information about the hazardous chemicals, including their physical and health hazards, quantities stored in locations within the facility. And as you can see here on the document that's included in the PowerPoint, the chemical they're looking at is naphthalene. You can see the hazards, flammable. Their max quantity is listed. How it's stored and where it's stored is also listed. So it gives you a plethora of information so that you can start doing these screenings and scenarios. Part 2 of 4, who receives the report? The LEPCs, like I said, the State Emergency Response Commissions, SERC, and the local fire departments and LEPCs. The local fire departments are usually the first responders that are sent to, like in East Palestine, to determine what's going on and then determine what assets and plans of action are supposed to occur. Part 3 of the 4 is when to report. Facilities must submit their initial chemical lists within a specified framework of time and then submit an annual inventory report by March 1st. And there's usually a push. I used to handle them at our fire department. Usually from this time till about March 1st, the mailman usually came with stacks of these Tier 2 reporting forms to the fire department. And the county used to just digitalize them and put them into a computer database called Cameo. So they have till March 1st to do this. After that, they can be fined. 404, what is considered a hazardous chemical? Chemicals are defined as hazards under OSHA's hazard communication standards. And it's just a list that comes out from the EPA and OSHA that lists all the hazardous chemicals that are out there. Now, the problem that you run into is that for every chemical name, there could be up to 30 or 40 synonyms for the same chemical. So you've got to, it might be called XYZ, but, some trade company might call it, Super XYZ or something like that. So you've got to look at all the synonyms for all these chemicals. The toxic chemical release inventory under Section 13 requires that facilities that manufacture, import, process, or otherwise use certain listed hazardous chemicals in quantities exceeding the specific threshold to submit an annual report detailing the amounts of chemicals. They want to know how much was released into the environment, how much is transferred off-site, managed waste. Essentially, this is known as the toxic release inventory, or the TRI. And there are actually 4 key parts to this as well. Part 1 of 4 is the chemicals that are covered. Again, there are specific lists of chemicals that are considered to have potential for significant human health or environmental impact that are covered under Section 313. The EPA itself uses, excuse me, the US EPA Toxic Release Inventory, which you can find at the EPA website, and it'll list the chemicals that they find that are toxic. Part 2 of 4 is reporting thresholds. Facilities must report if they're using a listed chemical above certain threshold quantities, which vary depending on the chemical. For all hazard chemicals which facilities are required to have or prepare an SDS sheet, the minimum for non-life hazard chemicals is 10,000 pounds. Now that doesn't, that sounds like a lot, but you can quickly hit 10,000 pounds with a pallet full of 55-gallon drums. So it's really not a whole lot. Now, the IDLHs are extremely hazardous substances. You get at about 500 pounds. So the threshold for those, because they're so dangerous, is much, much lower. The information that is reported must detail, like I said before, the amount of the listed chemical released into the air, water, or land, as well as quantities transferred offsite for disposal or treatment. And that's all covered under RCRA. And a lot of facilities get in trouble after the incident because they think, well, we've talked to EPA, we don't have to do anything else. But no, you actually have to make this report and tell them how much stuff has gotten released so that they know. And a lot of people mess up on that. 404 is the submission deadlines. Reports are typically due to the EPA by July 1st of each year. So if you've had a release, you've got till about July. They tell you to, as soon as possible, report this, but you've got till July 1st. It sucks for you if you happen to be, June 29th, and you've got to make a report by July 1st, but they give you a little bit of a grace time to report this. So, like I said before, when all of this comes together right, when you have got the tier 2 reports, when you have done the pre-planning, when you have done the scenarios, when you have equipped yourself, you've got the right equipment, you know what you're doing, you've done the screenings and scenarios, the incident that I had earlier in my career gets transferred to something much better. This is a chlorine leak, same wastewater treatment plant, 25 years difference between the two. And this is actually on US EPA website as one of the good examples of how this stuff is put together. Go ahead and play that.
About the chemical risks in their community. EPCRA protects communities by gathering chemical information from facilities to develop the local emergency response plans and inform the public on the chemical risks in their communities. The sources of this chemical information can be found under 4 main provisions of EPCRA. Specifically, Section 302 provides the basis of chemical information for developing the local emergency response plan by requiring facilities that handle extremely hazardous substances above a threshold planning quantity notify their CERC, LEPC, or their tribal equivalent. As required by the law, EPA published the list of extremely hazardous substances. Currently, there are 355. Section 304 requires facilities to report releases of hazardous substances under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980, or CERCLA, and EPCRA EHSs to the CERC, LEPC, and their tribal equivalent, TURC or TEPC. LEPCs and TEPCs must then update the emergency plan based on actual incidents and the response taken. Section 311 requires owner or operator facilities submit safety data sheets, and Section 312 requires the submission of an annual inventory report, also known as the Tier 2 form, of all hazardous chemicals at the facility. This information is made available to the public via the LEPC or TEPC or CERC or TURC. Section 313 requires facilities to report releases of toxic chemicals by submitting the Toxic Chemical Release Inventory Form, also known as Form R, annually. Local planners and responders, who are also LEPC or TEPC members, are encouraged to review the information submitted by facilities in your community, so you can be informed of the potential risks to prepare for and respond to any incident. A good example of the EPCRA infrastructure at work can be seen in how emergency responders responded to a chlorine leak in Youngstown, Ohio on May 4th, 2015.
All Youngstown firefighters are required to train monthly to combat a hazmat situation, but some who specialize in hazmat situations, like today's chlorine leak at the water treatment plant on the south side of Youngstown, train even more.
they train continuously. We have one 4-hour drill on a Wednesday and one 8-hour drill on a Saturday every month.
Training that came in handy when more than 500 gallons of chlorine leaked from a holding tank in the plant.
Once I had my HAZMAT team on scene, I got those guys dressed, they went in, and thank goodness it was a quick fix and everything was taken care of.
Mahoning County Deputy HAZMAT Chief Silverio Caggiano says his team has trained for a state-required scenario nearly identical to this 3 years ago.
We actually, in the HAZMAT world, did a worst-case scenario of a totally catastrophic release of chlorine.
So how bad could this have gotten?
If you took a look at the catastrophic sudden release, we were projecting like 8,000 people dead, 14,000 people displaced.
Deputy Chief Caggiano says he's thankful no one was hurt. Some businesses in the area of the nearby industrial park were upset they had to shut down for the rest of the day after they were evacuated.
We've got the leak, taken care of, but until we get rid of all the product that's left over inside, I'm not going to take a risk in having you people come to work. It's not worth it.
The streets that were closed and businesses that were shut down are expected to be back open at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. In Youngstown, Nathan Hoda, WKBN 27 First News.
So,
of the emergency planning infrastructure.
Here's a prime example of when it all comes together right, when you've done the training. And if you notice, what the US EPA used was a media news piece. Now, I always include the media in everything I do because that's how I get my information out. That's how everybody knows these streets are closed. I mean, I closed a freeway down. I closed 2 railways, including Norfolk Southern. I closed down 3 or 4 plants. I evacuated people out of houses nearby. I shut down a large area. And, it was the media that I got involved very early to get the information out. Everybody else, on the east side now, I told them shelter in place because they were out of the range of danger, but still I didn't want these people getting out and possibly, as the wind shifted, do this. And the way you do this is you get the media to be involved. So, in the Norfolk Southern issue, you can see here a post that was from a news person. The text came to me at about 11 a.m. in East Palestine. Now, I had known from an earlier discussion I had with the HAZMAT chief that was released from East Palestine, that at that time they had known what the chemicals were that were involved for well over 12 hours. But if you look, I'm trying to give this person and the news media the information they needed to determine what was there. But they're asking me, do you know why they won't tell us what exactly is in the cars? And my response is, no, it's public information. And it is. And for at least 12 hours, if not more, nobody was saying nothing. And I do believe, and Jess, correct me if I'm wrong, it wasn't until the news media started telling them that they know what was in those train cars that they actually admitted what was in the train cars.
They told us at first that it was Modelo, and they had pictures of burned train cars, of beer bottles, and they said that was what the big boom was the alcohol exploding.
Yeah, so here you have what has turned out to be a clandestine operation. And everything that you have heard so far had fell apart. There was no media and chemical right to know for the people that actually lived in the community. And, what was happening was they were sending me pictures. And they, the one that Jess was talking about, they said, well, this car was exploding and it looks like, munitions tops. And it was a T-box. And I have a program on my phone that's called AskRail because I've been a chief and I've been cleared to use it. I started checking what some of these were, and I said, first of all, it's not a Department of Defense explosive car because those cars are all marked DOD. I said, this is the T-box, and I looked it up, and it was malt liquor. It was the Modelo car that Jess was referring to. But then they started sending me pictures, of which alarmed me because they were sending me pictures. And I said, what the hell are you doing that close? But I started to get the chlorine cars. I started to get the ethylene oxide or ethylene glycol cars, the propylene cars. I started to get these cars. I'm telling them, well, this is this, this is that. And I'm asking them questions. They says, well, one of the chlorine cars keeps venting and burning. I says, well, if it's burning the chlorine or the vinyl chloride, then you're getting phosgene and all these other things. What's the evacuation? Well, so far it's only a voluntary evacuation. I said, well, they should be evacuating at least a half mile, if not 1 mile. So this is how all of this falls apart. And the sad part was when you read some of the documentation that went in testimony that went to the NTSB, they're claiming, only months before they actually did a tabletop exercise for this type of incident. So my question, right off the top of the bat, is what the hell went wrong? You're just right off training. How did you mess this up so bad? Moving on to the Resource Recovery and Resource Conservation Recovery Act, RCRA. RCRA gives the EPA the authority to control hazardous waste from cradle to grave. This includes the generation, transportation, treatment, storage, and disposal of hazardous waste. To achieve this, the EPA develops regulations, guidance, and policies that ensure the safe management and cleanup of solid hazardous wastes, and the programs that encourage the reuse, reuse, recycle end of all of this. But this all went south down in East Palestine for one particular reason, and it was they wanted to publicize their losses. They had this vinyl chloride that was involved in this incident. The shipper is not going to want it. The shippee, the person who's going to, isn't going to want it. So what are they going to do with all this chemical that they're stuck with? Well, publicize their losses. They decided through erroneous and duplicitous measures that they were just going to blow it up and burn it off into this town without any consideration as to what the long-term effects of the dioxins, the furans and all these other chemicals that they were releasing into the environment were going to do to these people. Some of these people are still suffering ill effects from the release. So they didn't abide by the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA. They thumbed their nose at it and they decided that they're just going to burn it off, and they pretty much lied to do it. And they didn't. One of the things that jumped out to me when I was watching the news conferences, which were exercises in futility, with the fire chief storming off in the middle of interviews because he didn't like the questions, was you had people from the EPA, you had the people from Norfolk Southern, and no experts. That really was weird to me. And that's what made me start to think, there's something really weird here, because, you don't let the spiller tell you how to clean up the spill. You talk to your experts, and there was none there. Lo and behold, when the NTSB hearing was held, the guy was there. They just never read him into the incident command because they were steering this to an end that they wanted. And because the people involved making the decisions, in Ohio, the fire chief is the incident commander. Because he didn't have the experience and the know-how to ask these questions, they basically led him down the primrose trail. And unfortunately, even when you back Norfolk Southern into a corner and proved that they did wrong, they pointed right at the fire chief and said, but he let us do it. So this is why it's so very important that people know the EPCRA laws, because somebody beyond the media should have been saying, hey, look, we're entitled to this information, and I even told the media, you're entitled to it. You tell them, I want to know because we're entitled to it. Now, unfortunately, this wasn't the impetus for what happened in Norfolk Southern. It was just duplicity. The oil and gas exemptions to chemical reporting are another problem that we run into. The oil and gas industry has had exemptions from several environmental laws, including EPCRA, and a few more that they've managed to get exemptions from. These exemptions make it very difficult for first responders like myself and the public to know what chemicals are actually being released. And some of them are pretty nasty beyond the volatile organic chemicals like benzene, ethylbenzene, toluene, xylene. You have radium-226, radium-228, and a whole host of other chemicals that they're putting down the hole, like biocides and acids and all this other stuff that are coming back up into the effluent. And they're exempt from reporting it. The exemptions from EPCRA are the petroleum exclusion. Crude oil and frac oil are excluded from the definition of the hazardous substance. So they're not considered hazardous, even though what's coming back up is hazardous. The Congress exemption, the oil and gas industry is exempt from disclosure requirements under EPCRA. Safe Drinking Water Act, or as we call it, the Halliburton Rule, hydraulic fracturing operations are exempt from SDW regulations or safe water regulations. Under the Resource Recovery Act, or RCRA, waste associated with the oil and gas exploration, development, and production are exempted from it. They're exempted from the Clean Air Act. The oil and gas industry exempted from certain sections in that act. The Clean Water Act. The oil and gas industry is exempted from certain sections of the Clean Water Act. The only one that they have to abide by is if they're going to contaminate a public water service, which they still do anyway, and they really don't care. If you have a well, they don't care. And even if you have public water like meander reservoir or some form of reservoir, they still don't care. So Ben is kind of leading the charge here. There's 250 plus injection wells in Ohio. The oil and gas waste brine spreading is being spread as a deicer and a suppressant. Plastic incineration plants are starting to pop up, and I made the analogy between the two. There's no difference between what happened at East Palestine with Norfolk Southern than a bad day at your plastic incineration plant. Hydrogen and carbon capture and sequestration, that's becoming a nightmare. And your own community issues if you have rail lines going through. If you're starting a grassroots organization, and this is one of the reasons why we put this together, is because I've noticed that as the politicians have quit listening to their voters, more and more of these grassroots organizations are popping up all over the country. I have given advice as far west as California. I've worked and testified for people in Denver, Colorado. I'm working in Pennsylvania. I've testified there. People down in Louisiana, that place is a mess down there. And there's all these grassroots organizations that are popping up. And a lot of these people don't know what I presented here, that you can do this. And even in our own backyard in East Palestine, they basically mushroomed an entire community so that they could get rid of a toxic chemical without it costing them anything. It didn't cost them anything, but it's costing the people that live in that community. Their property rights are their property values are in the toilet. Long-term effects, 20, 30, 40 years down the line, it's going to be bad. So my comment that I made in the news, they basically nuked a town with chemicals to get a railroad through, is exactly what they did. And they didn't care. And trust me, they're not really happy with the money that they're paying out. But it's just a drop in the bucket as to what they should be paying out to these people in damages and what they did. They keep trying to skirt around the dioxin issue. And the reason why they're trying to skirt around that is because once you find dioxin in a town, go look Times Beach, Missouri. It doesn't exist anymore. Love Canal, it doesn't exist anymore. And that's what they're trying to skirt around. And remember, here in Ohio, the Ohio EPA was there when they were burying contaminated dirt underneath the rail lines. And that contamination, it rained for a few days afterwards. There was wet weather. That stuff is now in the soil. and the water wells that they get their water from there are very shallow. They're not very deep. So it's only a matter of time before all that contaminant is going to get there. And they're saying that no, the water's safe. It's not going to happen. It's safe. But while they're saying it's safe, they're actually drilling monitoring wells between the wreck and the aquifers for East Palestine. For what reason? See how this stuff is progressing. So that's going to be a potential future problem for the people of East Palestine. I hope this has been informational. I've talked with Anton about in the future getting in deeper with each one of these sections. And Jess, do you have anything to say?
No, but I'm happy to segue into the Q&A portion. There were a couple of questions in the chat we can start with, if that's okay with you. Yeah. All
Take it
right.
away, Jess.
Awesome. Thank you. Connie has a question. Have there been any rumors regarding the Trump administration on cutting funding or staffing for SARA or EPCRA?
I'm more concerned with the people that they put in charge. There's an old saying, you can have a gazillion rules, but if you don't have cops to enforce it, you basically don't have rules. And that's what I think is going to happen with the EPA. I feel they're going to do everything they can to facilitate. I mean, he's made a statement, and it kind of echoes what happened under the Bush administration when they had that little whiteboard. What do you want? Write it on the board. We'll get it for you. That's where the Halliburton rule came from. And he's basically told the industry, what do you want? What do you want me to do? What do you need? And this is where it starts to get dangerous because they don't care. They just want to, this is what they want. Back to East Palestine. Norfolk Southern didn't care. They were ready to throw away a whole town. They threw away a whole town to get what they wanted. So, I'm holding my breath as to see what's going to happen with this group.
The accuracy of what you're saying, I can confirm because as quickly as they lifted the emergency evacuation order, there was a train that came rolling through a few minutes later. And those trains continued to roll through the town for about a month after they had purposely drained the vinyl chloride into a soil ditch that went into the water that they then ignited unnecessarily. And the only reason that they even started doing any cleanup is because we asked them to. We demanded that they do this because of the advocacy work of people like Chief. So we're really grateful for him. I can't think of any person in East Palestine that's like not in favor of the work that Chief has done in my community. Lori had a couple questions. Have you had experience with Ohio EPA? Have they been effective? And is there a state agency clearinghouse for spills, amounts, and cleanup actions?
I've worked extensively with the Ohio EPA through the years as I had on my HAZMAT side. But I will tell you that the field agents can only do what they're allowed. The head of the U.S. EPA, I mean, if you're going to put somebody in charge of the Ohio EPA, I mean, the head of the Ohio EPA, if you're going to put somebody in charge, you want to have somebody that has like a background in environmental work or a chemistry background or something that gives them some validity to watching over this group. No, this person is an attorney from, I think, American Energy Power. She was one of the attorneys from there, the ones that were involved with HAZMAT and all those people. And she got put in charge of the Ohio EPA. The U.S. EPA, the guy who was in charge of that, I have to have a bullshit decoder ring every time I listen to this guy talk about what went on down in Norfolk Southern because he's like all over the place, and it's like really, you can't it can't be night and dark at the same day and night at the same time, and that's kind of the way he rambles through stuff. And they're doing that because they too are trying to hide the fact that there is dioxins there. They were found. They just don't want to deal with it. So I trust some of the field agents, but as I was always told, that decision is above my pay grade. So as the EPA field agents are doing their job, there's someone looking over them and saying, go home. We'll take care of it from here. And that's what's going on in the Ohio EPA. And it's not just in Ohio. In Pennsylvania, I testified last month on an issue. The Pennsylvania DEP, who's supposed to be protecting people, had attorneys with the oil and gas company that I was testifying against, trying to help them defend against us. So it's not just there. And he ran into the same issue in Denver, Colorado. I mean, wherever you've got a certain demographic, political demographic, you seem to find these problems with the environmental protection people.
The next question was from Connie. Will the slides be available? Yes, and I believe this is also being recorded, so it would be available afterwards as well. Chris, your comments are long. I'm going to do my best, but if you want to hop off mute and ask them, she writes, Chief, in your experience, do companies report as soon as possible, or do they wait until that deadline, flooding our regulatory agencies with data? With that, why would this deadline be something that further complicates the true understanding of the impact upon the surrounding communities? As well, does this also impact emergency responders and how? There's a couple other questions on there, but
A lot
I'll
of times
start there.
the reason why they wait is because they're collecting their data to make sure that it's correct. A lot of times, like a couple of cases that I had with HAZMAT, they didn't know they had to do it. A lot of times that happens with public agencies, like the wastewater treatment plant. If it wasn't for the fact that they were reminded to do it, they wouldn't have done it and they'd have been fine. There are, for now, very stiff fines if you miss those deadlines. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars if you miss those deadlines. So the long period is so that the data is correct, and get their ducks in a row. But even then, they miss it, and there are fines if those deadlines are missed, and it affects the emergency response in a way that our reports are open ended. We don't close them until we have these reports and it's all in a file, and we close out the reports.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I did write a lot, sir. By the way, Chief, thank you so much. I really want to meet you and talk to you. I've been working with Justin Noble in a lot of work, so I feel like we have very good connection. I was former DOD, worked in weapons of mass destruction, as well as, so I have RCRA training in HAZMAT. I really appreciate you speaking out. It's very important for this. Meaning, I wasn't trying to confuse, but some of the things we've been told with like liquefied pipelines, liquefied gases, is that they have this all hazards plan, right? An emergency response. That's how they approach it. But what we found out is that they were not even fully informed about the hazards that were actually, associated with that. Like, for example, in HVL, you can't even turn your cell phone on. They can't even do reverse 911 or else in that leak, it'll blow up. So it's almost like what we dealt with in our communities. And I think a lot of communities are not understanding is that like the companies are limiting and almost compartmentalizing the information, as you said. But what we really want to encourage is people to be fully informed, right? And in that, when the public is not notified because people are getting their data together, when they're telling people there's an emergency, there's like a lack of full information as if they don't want to cause a panic, right? And so in our community, because we did a lot of work, we've informed our community, but limited, right? It was no help with the townships or any municipalities. They fought us hands in it, but we realized that we're only as strong as our weakest link. If somebody makes a mistake, we all go down. So we really were trying to get our communities out. So I want to know if you have any suggestions on how we communicate with our local emergency responders in these types of things instead of being looked at like when these industries come in, they separate us. But how do we approach, from your opinion, an emergency response aspect so we're not like against each other with our public servants?
One of the things that is my forte that they call me on is I pick apart emergency response plans. And the problem that you have with oil and gas industries and a lot of other industries is these are all cookie cutter emergency response plans. Insert name here, insert location, dot, 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 dot. And very few of them take into account, I should say, the actual logistics of what's going on. Unfortunately, a lot of these places have rural fire departments, and these rural fire departments are volunteer. Excuse me. Or as in the case of East Palestine, they have very small fire departments, and they're not very well trained. And especially in the oil and gas, it's those people are being mushroomed left and right because they don't want them to know what's going on. They go out of their way. And I bring this up continuously every time I testify. And I mean, Jess can tell you, the problems that occurred in East Palestine because of the lack of training, because of the lack of understanding. I mean, they were just exacerbating, and this is what causes the problems. My suggestion is to get more involved with the LEPC. They are a public entity. They do have to abide by Sunshine Act. You can call your EMA and find out when the meetings are and get involved. Jess, any other advice on your end?
Yeah, I think in this digital age where pretty much everyone has a cell phone or some sort of electronic device in their home, we really should be using that to our advantage to communicate, especially for safety things. And I know that there was an alert that went out to some folks in the area the night of the derailment. I did not receive one, and I am 2 miles out. And I know some folks in Pennsylvania did not receive it. So the fact that we don't have this type of organized emergency response is really unfortunate. And the way that things were delivered in the community on TV, we did have some regular updates, but different channels were reporting different information about where the emergency evacuation was, how big it was, what shape it was. And so it was really frustrating to see that. So I can't imagine being a resident would be different than, or would be much different than being a first responder because it was such a cluster from the beginning. So, but I'm, certainly, moving forward, any folks that are experiencing or fearful of experiencing a chemical disaster, if you have a train that rolls through your backyard, you're at risk for something like this. So, I'm happy to talk about some helpful solutions and ways that you can protect yourself and get involved in the local community and bring these things into light. I want to make sure to get to a couple other questions. I know we have about 10 minutes left. Lori asked, is there an up-to-date list of where oil and gas brine is currently being used as the de-icer or dust suppressant in Ohio? Looking for an updated list.
Anton, you want to jump in on that one?
I'll hop in on that one. Lori, if you could email me, we have to look specifically at what county and township you're in. ODNR has a master list, but it's actually not comprehensive. So the best thing we can do is request annual surface application forms filed with DNR to make sure that we have the most accurate information. So shoot me an email and we can touch base on that.
Thanks, Anton. Stephen asks, isn't there a requirement to post hazardous chemicals located on a private property, such as the list can be easily seen from a public right-of-way?
The only thing that they're required to do is put the NFPA diamonds, and they have to put the UNID numbers on their things. The UNID numbers for everybody here. One of the things, it's free. Get a hold of it. Go to the App Store and buy the Department of Transportation, or not buy, it's free. The Department of Transportation Emergency Response Guidebook. It's a free download. Don't pay for it. Keep looking. It's free. And you'll notice a lot of times when you pass by something, they'll have a 4-digit number. That's called a UNID number. And you could pretty much identify what the chemical is. And rail cars have it as well. You can identify what the chemical is by that. The NFPA diamond is also in that book. It tells you, if you have something that's got, the diamond has 4 squares: flammable, reactivity, health, all this other stuff. And if you've got something that's got all fours, you're dealing with a very bad chemical. So yeah, there's stuff that's there. As far as putting MSDA sheets out, no, they're not going to do that. But if it's a non-oil and gas facility, your first responders should have access to that through their own department and through the EMA.
The next question is from Randy. How prepared are local fire departments to handle a CO2 leak?
Specifically, I'm referring to what these carbon capture stuff. Because that's
Randy, did you want to clarify your question? Or Dr. Randy? Right.
Yeah, yes, the carbon capture that they're proposing right now. I know, like where we are, we have a all volunteer fire department, and they're not as well trained as they should be for sure with oil and gas and brine. But I don't think anybody has any idea about what CO2 could bring to the area if they start putting pipelines underneath. And we are one of the counties that's getting leasing right now for the CO2 pore storage space.
I think you, Randy, know as well as I know that there is a lot of, if they want to store it underground, how many holes do they have that's been drilled at the turn of the century into those shale levels or sandstone levels? I mean, there's a ton of problems, but I would venture to guess beyond knowing what carbon dioxide is, they probably have no idea how to handle it. Matter of fact, in the fire service a few years ago, well, probably about 15 years ago, when all the pop distributors or pop dispensers switched to CO2, and they were having these alarms going off, and firemen were going down there thinking they were regular fire alarms, and they were getting asphyxiated. So these are major fire departments. So the odds of a smaller rural fire department really understanding what the dangers are in connection with the carbon capture stuff. Here's another incident where I think we're probably going to end up having to educate these people about the dangers that are in there, if they even want to get educated, because a lot of these departments are told by the politicians to avoid that, or their funding is going to get cut. Bev Reed can tell you a lot more about that down in Martins Ferry. That very same thing. Pay no attention. We're going to give you money. If you don't do this, you're not going to get the money. So, and it's rough.
There are three questions left. I'm going to answer two of them, Chief, and then I'll leave the last one for you since it is a bit more resolution oriented. So Lynn asked to help clean up the soil. Have any agricultural plants like hemp been planted? There was a sunflower seed drive early on in the process in East Palestine, and I did speak with the EPA about this, and it was my understanding that any plants like that absorb those chemicals need to be disposed of as hazardous waste as well. And so we did not have a follow-up program for that, so I don't feel like that was an effective thing for my community. It felt better to just have, the professionals come in and clean up. But yeah, I'm happy to explore that more, maybe on another call for sure. Um, and then Ms. Deb, thank you for coming. She asked if people in my community are being offered training as firemen to help the community. This is an interesting question. So I do believe that the East Palestine, whoever responded to the fire in East Palestine, has a lot more knowledge now than what they did before on responding to a chemical fire of this magnitude. Norfolk Southern had promised to pay for a multi-million-dollar training center. They purchased a building in the town. They had a big grand opening ceremony where they didn't invite anyone from the community, but it was all over the newspapers. And they brought in this cute little train for an old train for the backsplash. Anyways, that's been canceled, and they will not be doing a training center, nor will we be the host for training for these types of chemical fires. So, a lot of empty promises from the rail company. Still, I don't know if you have any other comments on that. And then I'm going to lead us into the next question from Annette. Thank you, Annette, for joining us. Annette says that there was a styrene chemical spill in East Cleveland from a rail car, and there's not been any follow-up. It did affect at least 210 families. What are your thoughts on local ordinances for cities? And I'll say there's been a lot of spills since, or even locally in East Palestine. There was one I just read about in Canfield, Ohio, that was, I believe, oil. And they're just now getting around to community meetings about it. So I am curious, Sil, if you have any suggestions on ordinances about these types of spills.
The problem that you have is if you have a city, you can create an ordinance. If you have a township, you can't. So cities can create ordinances, codified ordinances. Townships can't do that. So there's the distinction between the two. The second part of that is getting the people to actually do it. And Lynn can tell you how much we went through, and Jess can tell you how much we went through just to get the city of Youngstown to recognize that, burning pyrolysis, tires in Youngstown was not a good thing to do. And finally, after, multiple meetings and beating it in their face, they decided to do something. So it's hard to get your politicians to do the right thing. Lynn got her stuff together. Jess came. We beat their faces in. I was told by the owner that I didn't know what I was saying, and then I just told him, well, you don't know chemistry. That's your problem. I mean, it's really rough because there's a lot of chatter there, and they come in and they jobs. We're gonna have jobs. In our area, just we're like carp on dough balls. We just get hooked in. Oh, jobs, yeah, we're gonna jobs, yeah, jobs with justice. You want this in your community? The city of Youngstown invested millions of dollars in their downtown area, and you're gonna put a pyrolysis plant down there? Hey, one bad day there, and your millions of dollars have went down the tube. I just read the other day that in Louisville, another site that they want to put one of these pyrolysis plants in, they're putting like $500,000 condos in, and from the front of the place you can see where the pyrolysis plant is going to be. They want to put the pyrolysis plant in Louisville. So you've got to work on the politicians. Be careful who you vote for. One of the prime examples of be careful who you vote for is from East Palestine. The fire chief that allowed East Palestine to get shit on was appointed by the governor to the state emergency response planning committee. That's the guy I want planning my next disaster. No, it's not. So who you vote for, find out what they want, get in their faces, get in their public meetings. That's the only way you're going to get any resolution to those things. And Norfolk Southern lied to these people. They lied to NTSB. They tried to hide things. If it wasn't for the attorneys, they'd have gotten away with a lot of it. But they had to file an injunction because they're trying to get rid of the rail cars before you can. They actually managed to hide one that we found in Conway, Pennsylvania, that was full of that they were saying it only had vapor of benzene, and it was empty. It had leaked. We found that it leaked. They were hiding it. They were trying to get rid of it. So you've got to get into your politicians' faces and demand that your rights are protected. You've got a right to clean air, clean water, and a safe place to live, and demand that from your politicians.
I agree. One of the strategies. Oh, Lynn, are you going to talk about what we did in Youngstown, Lynn? Okay. One of the things that So Be Concerned Citizens Sustainable Youngstown did, Annette, is, urged the start of a climate committee. Communities, members would speak at council meetings and really getting the word out and acting proactively as proactively as possible. Letting the town know that, this is, you're not going to stand for it. But getting those ordinances passed does require some relationship building, in my experience. So, getting to know a council member or getting to know the city law director, or you don't have to have an in to call your public official. And I cannot be more clear about that. You can just pick up the phone and give them a call and talk to them. And this is so important for everyone to know. I was recently in a job interview where they asked me, how do you contact your public officials? And I said, call them. And they thought that was the greatest answer. So apparently not everybody knows that. So I would empower you to do that. I know we're a couple minutes over time, Lynn, and then we'll hand it over to Anton to wrap. You're on mute, Lynn.
Okay, I just want to say don't depend on your electeds and appointeds because they don't even know what's going on and they're usually representing whoever has bribed them. So it's a real rough situation. We had years and years of fighting fracking and injection wells, and there was a lot of Koch brothers money put against us. And anybody who knows what happened in Youngstown with our Youngstown Community Bill of Rights being on the ballot 9 times, nobody's gotten an issue on the ballot 9 times that I know of. And what I want to say is you have to use civil disobedience a lot of times, like when Teresa Mills called us up and she said, hey, did you know you have a radioactive frack waste dump in Youngstown? And we're like, no. And it was right below the hospital, St. E's Hospital, across the river from it, down the hill, and right across from DeRusso Sausages. So we would go spot